All right. I don't know whether you're going to be into this or not, but get yourself a coffee, sit down, and have a listen to my nonsense. This is oh, I've completely mislabeled this. Change the title at the end. Um, this is from my compendium of shorter stories. I was going to do the Spartacus one, which is full of things like photographs from Fishbourne when they were doing the Felix Legion versus the Ermine Street Guard, those battles. That was brilliant. Look. Okay, excellent photos. So it's full of like, I've got guys to demonstrate their shit. They were fucking helpful. And I took things like this, which is from Trajan's column. And there's even things like that, which is my own artwork of a gladiator's helmet done out of felt tip. Yeah, and just general, some of the stuff's like quite educational. There's a fellow from the Ermine Street Guide, God bless them. I think that's Nigel. Great bunch of guys. So I was going to do this one, but instead I'm going to do from my collection of very water damaged shorter pieces, because this one, if you like it, there's a follow-up. Okay, so any questions, stick them in the chat. I will keep an eye on it. Out of the mists of time. We're going back a little way now. Tiger, 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 an American enterprise. One of the truly defining moments of World War II, one of the great fulcrums upon which the fates of nations would rest and swing, is the outset of hostilities betwixt the US and Japan. War fever had not yet struck America, to say it mildly. Few of the US's citizens were moved by the situation, unless they had relatives abroad directly affected by events, obviously most notably the Jewish chaps. There were even fewer Americans prepared to throw their lot into a world war at the behest of Europe. As far as the majority of Americans were concerned, the tumultuous events of 38 through 40 were but the latest installment in the grand bloody epic spectacle of European strife, another ghastly episode of the constant raging fight for preeminence among the European nations that had chaotically swept across that continent even since the departure of the Romans. It was no business of the US to go steaming in to interfere with that bloody mess, for had not the US been born precisely to get away from all that? This was the view of the average American on the ground, the voice of middle America, the will and collective mindset of what Nixon would later call the silent majority. At the top, the view was different. America's leaders had an altogether contrary way of seeing the war. At the pinnacle, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was all for joining in. Aside from any perceived humanitarian belief or discomfiture with Nazi ideals, the US president, FDR, could clearly see the myriad advantages of joining in a war against the Axis powers. With his family's long-established roots in the New York banking scene, FDR was in touch with the positive economic realities of going to war. Contrary to our short-sighted view of human history, the US was actually not the huge industrial behemoth of massive production that she has been in recent times. Not back in the pre-World War II days. The Great Depression had only just and barely abated. The great pestilent cloud of its squalid poverty had but recently receded, and FDR rode high as the champion of its retreat and dispersal. The war would focus America, bring her proud citizens closer together, unify public efforts, convert their energy into a truly global power. But as I said, the American people simply weren't into it. They balked at the idea of war. They hated the idea. The public rejection of taking up arms against the Axis powers was a major stumbling block to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plans. Through 1940 and into early 41, the president took a number of steps to counter this, to slowly bring the people round, to get them on board for the war. His methods for achieving this were not all that subtle. In retrospect, they stand out proud and obvious in the great annals of history as a deliberate goading of the enemy. Like a set of sore thumbs rammed up Hitler and Hirohito's arses, FDR knew that the Axis powers had to make the first overt move. The public, content for the moment on simple survival after the drab monstrosity of the Great Depression, and still shaken by the brutalizing experience of the blood-filled trenches of World War I, had an absolute abhorrence of war at this point. They would only get themselves onto a war footing if they were totally pushed into it, forced into it, pretty much only if the enemy made a direct aggressive move against US citizens on US soil. FDR knew that little else would turn the tide. Nothing less than something akin to the invasion of the American homeland by Axis forces would do the job, the immense job of raising within the hearts of US citizens the appropriate anger and resentment to drive the Axis armies from the face of the earth. But how to put Axis strategies into such a motion without appearing obscenely duplicitous? A properly devious set of policies were created to support the military efforts of the Axis enemies. The UK, Russia and China all got sturdy military and material support. Sturdy, but of the behind-the-counter, under-the-table kind of sturdy support. It was a clever stratagem. Invisible, the US had thrown all of its chips onto the game, irrevocably channeling its destiny into a high-stakes gamble, playing for the fall of Axis powers, yet without ever having shown its full hand. Lend-lease, humanitarian aid, foreign observers, commercial security, diplomatic obligation, logistical protection, all became the weapons and language of US duplicity. In the case of Japan, for instance, the US froze all of her Western assets and cut off her oil and rubber lifeline from the Dutch East Indies. At the same time, the US supplied weapons and training to China, Japan's main enemy at this point. The military observers were there really training the Chinese masses to effectively defend against Imperial Japanese soldiers and how best to employ the weapons, rifles and artillery that the US had made and supplied. This is but a small slice of the action we're talking about here. In 1940 and mid-41, the US were waging a clever war, influencing the fates, and yet seemingly neutral to the rest of the world, aloof. She wasn't, of course. In fact, she was raring to go, just itching to get into the fight. Well, to be fair, it was really only a specific contingent of Americans that were burning for war, but this was a significant contingent, and they had their hands upon the levers of power. But they were not blood-crazed war dogs. They were sensible people, well aware of the risks and perfectly in tune with the realities of possible conflict. Before any war could be waged, a carefully prepared indoctrination of the American people would have to be applied. The measured dose of propaganda, ever the faithful tool of the politician. And no one could have missed the efficacy of Nazi propaganda upon the German people, and how well it had achieved its aims of generating war fever amongst the, until recently, pacifist nation, fresh with their own bleeding wounds from World War I. And so, history has two distinct views of how it went down as far as the US joining the war. One has FDR saying, "One war at a time," meaning stay out of the Pacific and concentrate on Adolf first. And the other has FDR saying, "How do we best make Japan make the first move? So we have to get in," or words to that effect, in private talks with Secretary Stinson and in secret planning sessions with Harry Hopkins. The effect was to have an American public chiefly centering their attentions upon the war in Europe. Daily headlines ran with the situation of the Blitz in London. Fierce and moving radio broadcasts were made from there by American journalists embedded in the bombed-out streets of England's capital, describing to their people back home in the US just how horrific it all was and how tough it was to live inside a modern war. Meanwhile, the public knew about the economic sanctions against Imperial Japan, but thanks to heavy coverage about visits from Japan's ambassador to the US to come to a settlement, no one was unduly worried by events in the Pacific theater. Of course, as we all know, this changed drastically post-December the 7th, 41. What has not been so clear is how this fell perfectly in line with US plans for initiating their part in the war. But this has become obvious over time, as historians with keen minds process the ever more available facts. Though many of these facts are open to multiple variants of interpretation and are the subjects of endless debate, some things are undeniable, and some facts in history are utterly concrete. The actual events of December 7th, 41 and how they played out in the skies and on the seas are concrete enough. One thing was for sure. The Japanese were pissed about the arms sent to China, the trucks and tanks sent to Russia, the confiscation of assets, and the strangulation of their oil and rubber supplies. Mostly they were pissed about that oil. All of Japan's campaigns to increase their empire and create a new imperial Japanese future depended entirely upon that oil supply. It is 1941, and Japan has decided to strike. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the IJN, was requested by senior members of the War Cabinet, now in control of government, to formulate a plan to strike the US hard. Yamamoto was tasked to destroy, or at least severely cripple, the US's striking power at the very outset of hostilities. This was under the open cover of frantic negotiations between the diplomatic arms of both nations, a desperate attempt, as far as the newspapers were concerned, to break the deadlock that had hardened the relations betwixt the US and Japan. For the Japanese, however, this was a strategy of buying time and wrong-footing their enemy just prior to attack. Now that Japan had left her place at the table of the League of Nations, the forerunner to today's UN, she was free to do whatever she pleased to further ambitions for a global empire. The invasion of Manchuria, the Great Eastern Bloc of China, was somewhat akin to Adolf's invasion into Russia as part of his policy of finding and securing living space for the German people. Now with the East Indies oil supply in the balance, Imperial Japan found more reasons to further conflagrate the war that had already burning across half the world. By attacking the US, that conflagration would at last become a true world war, an epic fight of obscene and awesome proportion. And war was already high on the US agenda, with the UK looking increasingly isolated as the only powerful nation left making a stand against Hitler. That plucky little island did all it could to include the US amongst its allies. This came in the form of the UK's legendary leader, Winston Churchill, who appeared like an angel through the smoke of the Blitz to inquire of FDR exactly what he was going to do about it. And exactly on where on the fence did he sit? This nudged FDR into support. He had long been an admirer of old Churchill, and both of them from senior naval backgrounds. The two hit it off immensely and developed the kind of special relationship that has kept the UK and the US pally ever since. Because one has to remember, they are traditional enemies, really. Anyway, with FDR giving Churchill all the support he could without actually going all out and declaring war, it looked increasingly inevitable that the US would eventually join in. Some of the intellectual community, though, didn't like the idea at all. And then there were some outright opponents like Wendell Willkie, firm in their belief that the US should remain neutral. And on top of that were those openly supporting the Nazi regime and wanted the US to side with them. People like Joe Kennedy, the father of future President John F., and even a low character indeed called Prescott Bush, who made his money laundering Nazi gold extracted from unwilling death camp Jews and the like. He would later be indicted for this and treason against the US. This man is the father of future President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of future President George W. It takes all sorts. Anyway, in the end, none of this mattered. All that mattered was that FDR's prayers were answered and his plan fell into place on December the 7th at Pearl Harbor. Just as was earnestly hoped, the Japanese struck first, and they struck hard. So, I'm just going to have a little break for a second. It's actually, I kind of need to rehearse this, reading like this. It's not easy at all. And my words aren't smooth. I'm not the best writer. It's a bit clunky. My throat's really dry. Guess if having a vape isn't helping. Oh, see if there might be a mouthful of tea. Yeah, a little lickety. But I'll give you some more. There's not a massive amount. Well, okay, there is a fair amount. Maybe do, I don't know. See how it goes. See if you like it. You might hate it. Maybe you want some more guitar. I don't know. Am I going to give you any guitar? Oh, I don't know. So I'm going to continue just a little bit longer. Cloaked in the cover of diplomatic negotiations, the IJN prepared an attack on the Pacific Fleet. Events earlier in 1941 had perhaps provided inspiration. The plucky pilots of the UK had executed a beautiful strike against the Italian fleet at its anchorage in Taranto Bay. This, like Pearl, was a shallow water harbour, and so posed a similar set of technical difficulties to become overcome. So the IJN, never slow to realise the potentials of the latest military technology, took a close interest in the Taranto raid and made a note of all of its operational details. See that? Starting to get Jacques Louis David tumour on the side of my face. It's actually an abscess, obviously. Looks terrible, doesn't it? Anyway, to carry on. It was a night raid. This is the Taranto raid the Japanese were studying. It was a night raid centered around the Royal Navy aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. On board the aging biplane Fairy Swordfish, a torpedo bomber that, though it looked for all intents and purposes like a World War I biplane, was in fact a reliable and sturdy workhorse that was well loved by the crews that flew them. And they had been well-blooded, having earlier that same year sunk Hitler's prized battle wagon, the Bismarck. Around 170 miles from their target, the 24 aircraft loaded and armed themselves with a torpedo each and readied themselves for the strike on the Italian fleet. Word had it that 5 of its possible 6 full-on warships were there, at anchor, waiting. Scheduled to strike at exactly 9 p.m., the first wave of torpedo Swordfish managed to achieve total surprise, with the second wave, which came on in about an hour later, having just as much success. The upshot being that Italy lost 3 of her prized capital vessels for the price of just 1 Swordfish down, destroyed in a massive shockwave from the air blast of his own torpedo drop, smack dab into a powder magazine. It was a remarkable and bold raid, and it truly was a dynamic raid, and its success was not lost on the IJN. The Japanese Navy was always quick to develop new tactics and technologies to apply to its ever greater combined fleet air arm. Indeed, in the late summer of 41, Japan looked to have pretty much the most amazing, up-to-date, and powerful navy in the whole world. Imperial Japan had done a fantastic job of embracing the many challenges of carrier-based warfare and would do much to demonstrate the validity of these tactics through the rest of the war. She had much the best of the first-rate heavy aircraft carriers of the day and had the best trained pilots in the most modern naval aircraft to stock them full with. This left the rest of the globe to play catch-up to some degree. In a side note, strangely, the Germans didn't even join in this arms race, having 1 experimental carrier to her name through the whole war. So cutting edge on all things martial, I find it odd that she didn't pursue carrier tactics. Weird. The UK, though, never slow to polish the prestige of its Royal Navy, had been the ones to first properly employ the aircraft carrier and did much to push its development. With the HMS Argos, she had dramatically demonstrated the capabilities of such a vessel as early as the 1920s. The US had less than half the amount of first-class carriers as the IJN, but had many up on the drawing board, and some even nearing completion in the country's many naval yards. These naval manufacturing plants were to be the real enemy of the IJN, and perhaps the great unsung hero of the war. Just like she had in the Great Civil War of the mid-19th century, the United States produced her way to victory, outsupplying the enemy at every turn. So, though the US had far less carriers compared to Japan for now, the IJN could never hope to produce the amount of new aircraft that the US could, if she put her mind to it, and the IJN knew it. As early as July 41, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had set the minds of his strategists to accomplish the task of delivering a knockout blow to the US fleet. Yamamoto, himself having been educated in the US at Harvard University, had an instinctive feel for the US mindset. He was also a highly accomplished naval technician. He had noted, along with his fellow commanders, the Taranto raid and its runaway success. He intended to emulate the British assault, but on a far grander scale. With the help of senior strategist Commander Genda of the Fleet Air Arm, Yamamoto devised a massive attack. On Pearl Harbor. They had got round the difficulties posed by launching torpedoes in such shallow water. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who was destined to lead the attack, says in his own words, "Early November, we licked the torpedo problem. We added more wooden fins to our torpedoes and practiced dropping them from around 50 feet instead of the usual 300 or more." The Japanese... Oh, by the way, that I once had all of the war journals of all of the characters in this story. Oh, you know, there was a time that I had wonderful research materials at my fingertips. You know, the hell of being homeless, the hell of fucking relationships fucking up and rendering you homeless. Oh my God, am I fucking so fucking tired of that. I'm never doing it again, never having any of that bullshit ever again. Anyway, back to the bullshit. The Japanese were ready. They would strike in a cloak of secrecy, cluttering US naval listeners and codebreakers with a wave of misleading information. To get the aircraft within striking distance, the IJN task force would have to sail for at least 12 days, and she had to do this undetected if the plan was going to work. This they managed to do, though records indicate that Australian intelligence gave reports of a large Japanese task force moving towards Pearl Harbor on December the 3rd. Deep in the moonless dawn, the IJN fleet reached its strike point 230 miles north of Hawaii. 6 capital aircraft carriers, 3 submarines, and 22 other vessels were on the verge of disgorging great havoc upon the beasts of the West. This havoc took the form of 50 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, 50 Val dive bombers, 40 low-altitude torpedo bomber Kates, and another 50 high-altitude Kates, Nakajima B-5N2s. An hour after this first wave left the carriers, another 170 attacking aircraft took flight and made formation towards the pretty Hawaiian island on a cool, crisp, clear, and quiet Sunday morning. It was 6 a.m. So that'll do for today, as far as that. If you want some more, I will continue. I will probably continue whether you want it or not, because frankly, I don't care. This is my channel. I do what I like. But there will be more music. I kind of like it when it gets dark and I can put the flashy lights on and make it look like a sort of gig. And frankly, I didn't start playing guitar too late today. Usually I'm early start. Usually I've done 3 or 4 hours by the time I get to here. Today, I just had a quick go for about half an hour. And I just fancied reading something for a change. I mean, at some point, I'll do artwork. You know, you can see my artwork in here. Okay, that's all mine. Hey Tara, shout out to Tara. That's all mine. Shout out to Sarah. That's all mine. Shout out to that stupid dumb bitch, whoever her name was that worked in HMV. But yeah, you know, sounds. It's the sacred triangle. Okay? It's the music, it's the art, it's the writing. So it's like sonic, literate, and whatever fucking painting is. Anyway, any questions, hit them in the comments below. Be good if you subscribed. I'm nearly at 150, which is amazing, really great, being that I don't think I was on 100 at the start of the year. So, you know, all of this effort has been worthwhile. Not really getting a very good view count compared to my old videos, got to say. But it's working because there's been, you know, this quite upsurge in subscriptions. And leave some lovely comments. I've been getting some lovely messages. Really appreciate that. And there's even a few actual like, oh, I'm not going to get into that. I'll save that for another day. But yeah, can say hello to my little echinocactus, and I guess that will do. All right. Love you all very much. Stay safe out there. Keep your loved ones close. Keep your eye on the horizon for awful enemies. And I will see you next time. Rock on!